All right, so for the next couple of videos, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time trying to explain the why, the method to my madness as to why we're going to be talking about morality for the next little while. Understand that morality is just knowledge of the objective difference between right action and wrong action. And, I understand that morality is not a very popular thing to study, and judging from previous videos that I've made on the topic, it's not popular at all when it comes to getting views and stuff like that. So why study morality? Well, I don't particularly study it for any other reason than to better understand my own feelings, my own emotional state, because that's what it does. It does a relatively good job at doing that, and it does that because morality is the study of the knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong behavior, right and wrong action. And our conscience is an emotional awareness of morality in regard to one's behavior. It's a sense, it's a feeling of right and wrong that urges one to act morally. And so you can better come to understand the why behind the way that you're feeling if you better understand why your emotional state, why your conscience is making you feel particular ways. We feel good when we commit good action, when we commit right action, and we feel bad when we commit wrong action and bad action. And if you accept that premise, then it becomes abundantly important to understand what right action is and understand in particular what wrong action is, so you can make sure to minimize that as much as you possibly can in your life. And in doing so, talking about this stuff, I spent a lot of time studying successful philosophers of the past and successful people in general, military strategists, even modern psychologists as well, who are alive today. And all of these people talk about this kind of voice inside of their head, that they have this voice or something that's going on in there. And this voice, they often attribute this voice as something that has helped them exponentially improve their lives, or it was something that they listened to, and then it was like a turning point in their lives. It changed them. It fundamentally, when they started listening to this voice, it fundamentally changed who they were, and they became the person that we actually know them as when we read them in history and stuff. And when you read this stuff, you keep bumping into this idea of a voice or some daemon or something that's going on inside the mind of these people that I don't think is particularly special. I think they're just trying to describe their conscience in such a way that won't get them sent to any insane asylum, while still being honest with what is occurring inside of their minds. And on top of that, also, a lot of these philosophers come from a time when it was okay to say that you were talking to gods or angels or whatever, and really, I just attribute that stuff to them trying to explain their conscience, telling them what the right thing to do is and what the wrong thing to do is. And honestly, when you bump into sort of these coincidences time and time again as you're studying successful people, and that's really all that I really do. I just study what successful people do and then try to emulate what they're doing. And as you continue to add the list of people who talk about this voice, it becomes abundantly clear that there's something going on here that you can't just ignore, and you can't just pretend that it's just some childish thing that people back in the day talked about, and that it doesn't occur anymore today. Because I've modern examples as well, because we are going to go through a couple of examples to talk about this voice or this daemon or this lesser god or whatever this thing is, because I want to know more of that. Because all of these successful people have it, and they're willing to talk about it, and so I want to know more about it. And so let me show you some examples. So chronologically, starting with Socrates. Socrates called this thing a voice, which he believed was a gift from the gods, which he thought made him unique. Socrates said, "The favor of the gods has given me a marvelous gift, which has never left me since my childhood. It is a voice which, when it makes itself heard, deters me from what I'm about to do and never urges me on." This voice gave only negative admonishments to Socrates, such as "don't do that" or "don't say that," and would warn that certain actions and events would lead to disaster. Plato who was highly influenced by Socrates, called this voice his daemon. And he believed that it was a kind of spirit that, it receives his man at birth and lives with that man for his entire life and into death. And he called it the daemon which has received us as its portionment. And so moving on from the Greek 3, we have Apollonius of Tyana, who also mentions gaining access to the inner voice only after he had begun to put into practice the Hermetic principles. And I only point that out because during the General Principles of Natural Law video, we learned about the Hermetic principles, which I defined as the general principles of natural law. On top of that, we have Apuleius, who wrote that the daemon were immediate powers of divine order. They fashion dreams and inspire soothsayers. We have Cassius Maximus Tyrius, who also wrote about this voice, and he stated that they are inferior immortals, called gods of the second rank, placed between earth and heaven. And we can even talk about one of the more fantastic versions of this voice, which is the story of Joan of Arc. And for those of you who don't know, Joan was just a poor woman in France who had not surprisingly, had no military experience, but she had this voice that she talked about during her trials that told her to support Charles VII and recover France from English domination late in the 100 Years' War. She said that the voice told me 2 or 3 times a week that I, Joan, must go away and that I must go into France. My father knew nothing of my going. The voice kept urging me to go into France. It said I could no longer remain where I was. The voice told me that I should raise the siege laid to the city of Orleans. The voice instructed me that I should make my way to Robert de Bougicourt in the fortress of Vauceliers, and the captain of that place that he would give me men to go with me. The uncrowned King Charles VII sent Joan to the siege of Orleans as part of a relief effort, and in 9 days the siege was lifted. And after several additional swift victories that also included Joan, this led to Charles VII's coronation, which kind of reversed the morale of France and was allowed him to gain a long-awaited boost in motivation, and then they were able to win the 100 Years' War. Joan's voice even predicted her eventual capture, and the only time she ever disobeyed what her voice was saying, the resulting action caused her to be burned at the stake. And this isn't just a thing that occurred in classical history or long ago in antiquity. I heard a story of, what's his face? Just off the top of my head, I'm just thinking of this one. What's his name? Tyson Fury, talking about this voice, telling him to not commit suicide because he has his family to live for. And on top of that, we also have this one that I've written out, which is from the modern psychologist Dr. Jordan Peterson, who mentioned a voice in his preface to his book Maps of Meaning, which is a wonderful book that I suggest everybody read. He wrote, "I started to hear a voice inside my head commenting on my opinions. Every time I said something, it said something critical. The voice employed a standard refrain delivered in a somewhat bored and matter-of-fact tone. You don't believe that, that isn't true. You don't believe that, that isn't true." Very similar to what Socrates was talking about or tried to explain. The voice applied such comments to almost every phrase I spoke. I couldn't understand what to make of this. I knew the source of the commentary was part of me, but that knowledge only increased my confusion. Which part precisely was me? The talking part or the criticizing part? If it was the talking part, then what was the criticizing part? If it was the criticizing part, well then, how could virtually everything I said be untrue? In my ignorance and confusion, I decided to experiment. I tried to only say things that my internal reviewer would pass unchallenged. This meant that I really had to listen to what I was saying, that I spoke much less often, and that I would frequently stop midway through a sentence, feel embarrassed, and reformulate my thoughts. I soon noticed that I felt much less agitated and more confident when I only said things that the voice did not object to. this came as a definite relief. My experiment had been a success. I was the criticizing part. And so, I just want to indulge you in one last example of this voice that a friend of mine expressed to me recently. One of the wonderful things about being me and talking about the mind and everything is that my friends feel very comfortable in sharing with me things that are going on inside of their mind. And that's a lot more interesting for me because we get to talk about more interesting stuff as opposed to just, like, how's the weather or whatever normal people talk about. Well, she was telling me a story about how this voice affected her greatly in her life because she had booked a plane ticket to get back home after a long vacation, and she had to get back very quickly because it was her and her husband's anniversary the following day, and so she was very motivated to get back home, and unfortunately for her, she heard this voice inside of her head that just kept telling her to not go on the plane. And so the voice, she told me that the voice just kept repeating, don't go on that plane, don't go on that plane, don't go on that plane. And she was unable to shake the command of the voice, so she canceled her flight. She canceled her booking. She didn't go on the flight. Well, the craziest part about this story is that the plane that the voice told her not to go on was American Airlines Flight 77, and the date of her booking was September 11th, 2001. The aircraft was hijacked by 5 terrorists and was deliberately crashed into the Pentagon, killing all 64 people on board. And she would have certainly been a statistic, a very sad statistic, in that story, had she not listened to her inner voice. And so, I just wanted to show these examples of both modern stories and stories of the past of very successful, very historical people who talk about this voice. And I just don't think that it's rational to just ignore the fact that so many people, so many successful people, talk about this voice, say that they have heard this voice and are trying to express this thing. I just don't think that we should just reject it. There's too many coincidences here. And so I really don't attribute much to this voice at all, as opposed to just saying that this is just our conscience trying to tell us things that we're not consciously aware of. Okay? And so I don't think that there's anything magical or special or anything about this voice. And, honestly, having come across this voice as well myself in a very similar way as the way that Apuleius experienced this voice, which was through practice of the Hermetic principles, starting to follow the general principles of natural law and studying them and implementing them in my everyday life. I can tell you that there's nothing, magical going on here. It's just that it seems that our conscience is just trying to tell us something that we're not consciously aware of. And if we can study what these morals are that affect our conscience, then we can better understand the feelings that we're feeling, the experiences that we're experiencing, and how we feel about them as we commit these actions in our everyday lives. And so, what we're talking about here is your conscience and common sense as well, because if you're able to interpret the thoughts, the emotions of your mind, the emotions of your heart consciously, then you'll have very quick access, almost near instant access to the intuitive nature of knowing itself, because you'll know what the right thing to do is, and you'll also know very quickly what the wrong thing to do is at a much faster rate by simply trusting your gut again. This is all about trusting your gut again. That's what this is about. And so we can do what I like to do with words, which is break them apart, and we can do that with conscience. So con, as a prefix, means with, and science comes from the Latin term scientia, which just means knowledge. And so our conscience is our intrinsic connection to knowledge, because if we listen to it and understand it, it can then immediately or very quickly tell us or guide us to the exact answer, the correct answer of what to do with, relatively shocking, precision. And so really what this is the idea of gnosis. Okay, gnosis is a knowing knowledge, a judicial inquiry. Justice is all about right and wrong. Okay? It's all about what's just and unjust, right and wrong, and it's all about reward and punishment. And as we'll learn, that's how our emotions act as well. They act as a reward when we do right action, and they act as a punishment when we do wrong action. Okay? And this is really our connection to knowledge itself, because knowledge of the right thing to do in a particular situation and knowledge of the wrong thing to do in a particular situation, it's this knowledge of our conscience that is the key to opening the door to this gnosis, okay? And so your conscience is your natural intuitive awareness of morality in regard to your behavior, as stated earlier. And it's a sense of right and wrong that uses your emotion as its language to urge you to act morally or correctly, because doing right action will make you feel good, and it's trying to get you to not do wrong action because or by making you feel bad. And because you're doing something wrong that it doesn't want you to do, that it doesn't want you to do because it wants you to be successful, it wants you to commit right action. And I find that fascinating that that's just kind of built into our system. It's all there, okay? We just have to understand it. We have to take the time to decipher it and study it, okay? And so, our conscience is our internal moral compass because it does what a compass does. It guides us to the right answer. It guides us to where we actually truly want to go, even if we're consciously unaware of it. And so it's always there, and it's always doing what it does, which is trying to guide us to right action. But if you were never consciously taught the difference between right and wrong, then you're going to have a hard time understanding what your emotions are trying to tell you. You're going to wonder why you feel the way you feel if you don't understand morality, because your conscience acts based upon morally. It makes you feel based upon moral actions, your decisions in the real world, your behavior. Okay? And so this lack of emotional understanding can lead to a sense of listlessness, feelings of being lost, loneliness, and depression, because you don't know why you're feeling good when you're feeling good, and you don't know why you're feeling bad when you feel bad, and thus you have no control over your emotional state. This is all about control. Okay? You have no control of your emotional state if you don't know why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. And morality gives us insight, deep insight as to why we're feeling the way that we're feeling, because it acts as a template, an overlay of our conscience. And so people can grow to ignore this inner voice, this inner conscience, with the use of drugs, with the use of SSRIs, opioids, antidepressants, and also alcohol. And other individuals can even consider this conscience a hindrance to that's kind of holding them back, because it's making them feel bad when they feel like they shouldn't feel bad. I just don't think that it is. I think that all it wants us to do is to commit right action, always. And if we start at that premise and work from there, you can kind of get a better insight, as opposed to just not liking it when you're feeling bad. Okay? And so, your conscience is your emotional connection to the knowledge of right and wrong. And ultimately, that's a big deal, because the knowledge of right and wrong in all walks of life determines your success or failure in anything that you do. You know, you give more right answers on a test, you're going to get a higher grade. You give more wrong answers on a test, you're going to get a lower grade. Who gets a lower grade on a test and feels better, as opposed to that same person getting a higher grade on the test? You know, that's very rare. Most people feel good when they succeed. Most people feel good when they give more right actions than wrong actions, okay? And so, ultimately, this is where kind of the line gets drawn in the sand, if you will, in terms of being a conscious and a conscious being that can make choice, okay? And this choice is, will you take right action or will you take wrong action? And really, that's the question that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about later on, because that's the only real question that we have in our very much determined universe that we find ourselves in. Will you choose to take right action, or will you choose to take wrong action? And so, ultimately, I think the problem for most of us when it comes to our conscience isn't that it's not pointing true north. I believe that most of our consciences are pointing true north. And if it's not for you, then that just means that you have a mental issue that you have to overcome first and foremost. You have to go to the doctor, try to figure out what's going on, what's wrong. But for most of us, I believe that the issue is simply not that our conscience is not pointing true north, but that we were never taught how to use this compass. If you're never taught how to use a compass, then the compass is totally useless. And so what that means is that we were never seriously taught the objective difference between right action and wrong action. And, unbelievably, some of us may even believe the erroneous belief that we get to choose what the right action is and what the wrong action is in our reality. And that simply is not the case. That simply cannot be. Always go back to mathematics, which is the most logical language that there is out there, okay? It doesn't matter how much you demand. It doesn't matter how much you say. It doesn't matter how much you, gaslight people, okay? If you say that 2 + 2 = 5 and that's right, well, you're wrong. Nothing is going to ever change that. 2 + 2 will always equal 4, okay? And you cannot change that just by saying it so, all right? And we got to talk about that because that's dangerous. That's dangerous thinking. And so, in order to reclaim our ability to trust our conscience again, we have to make our conscience conscious. We have to make our emotional state conscious for us. We have to know why we feel the way that we feel. We have to consciously come to know the definitive knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong according to natural law. Then the binary choice of choosing between right action and wrong action becomes common sense. It becomes obvious. This stuff is not hard. The most challenging part about teaching morality to people is convincing them that this study is very, very, very simple. It's so simple, in fact, I feel like people just have forgotten to teach it. Because, sometimes some of the most simplest things, people just assume that everyone just knows it and then moves on. And things just get lost in the fold all the time like that. But ultimately, I want to get on with this. Ultimately, morality is the unifying concept that actually binds our thoughts and emotions and actions into one because it consciously tells us what our emotional conscience already knows about our actions in the real world, and it illuminates it for our conscious mind, our thinking mind, our rational mind, and it tells us why our emotions are feeling the way that they are in relation to our actions in the real world. Thought, emotion, action, all of them acting as one, simply because we need to know why we feel the way that we feel, because the feeling is going to be there whether we know the why behind the feeling or not. Okay, and just because you do know the why behind it doesn't mean that the feelings or the emotions are going to go away. That's not the point of it. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'm getting phone calls, so I gotta go. I'll see you in the next one.